In our next interview, we will meet Professor Ted Dinan, a molecular psychiatrist and neurophysiologist who has worked extensively in the area of the brain gut axis and the gut brain axis, and he will speak about the relevance of that to human health.
The brain gut axis is the communication system between the gut and the brain. It's a bidirectional communication system. So there are signals going from brain to gut and from gut to brain. And of course, in recent years, it's become clear that microbes within the gut form a very important component of that communication system. When I was a student, we were just taught that microbes within the gut were commensal. They didn't really do us any harm. We fed them. They didn't do us any good either. We now know that they are a very important component in the brain gut axis communication system. Well, indeed, food plays a very important role, obviously, because what we eat determines the constituency of the gut microbiota, or the microbes within the gut. But of course, what we eat also determines the status of our brain. So, diet undoubtedly is a very important factor. The brain is monitoring all organs within the body, the lung and all other organs in the body. I do think that the brain gut interaction is more complex and is more important than the relationship between the brain and other organs in the body. But undoubtedly, the brain is receiving inputs from every organ in the body. I mean, it is the master controller and is receiving, as I say, inputs from every organ in the body. There's increasing evidence that that is the case. I mean, if animals are raised in an entirely germ free environment where they have no bacteria in their intestine, the brain does not develop normally. I mean, we've shown that, for instance, serotonin, many readers will be familiar with serotonin. It's a transmitter that's important in relation to mood and sleep and other aspects of behavior. And there is overwhelming evidence that the serotonergic system, for example, doesn't develop normally if the brain gut axis isn't functioning normally at an early stage in development. There are many different communication channels. Obviously, the second brain or the enteric nervous system is one important communication system. It's clear that the stress axis, many readers will be familiar with cortisol because it's part of that stress axis. That stress axis, which is referred to as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, plays a very important role in connecting the brain and the gut. There are many molecules that are produced within the gut that play an important role in regulating the brain. For example, short chain fatty acids like butyrate, propionate, acetate are produced in the gut and travel through the bloodstream to the brain and play an important role in regulating brain function. And they do it in rather complex manners. There isn't one way in which they do it, but there are a complex interplay between these molecules and the brain. I've mentioned serotonin already, and it used to be said that the building block of serotonin, tryptophan, came entirely from the diet, and people would say eat a lot of turkey or whatever, and there'd be loads of tryptophan. We now know that tryptophan can actually be manufactured by bacteria within the intestine, and tryptophan, as the building block of serotonin, our capacity as humans, we have a very limited storage capacity for tryptophan. So we don't really store it in any quantity. So we need a constant supply of tryptophan crossing the blood brain barrier in order to maintain serotonin transmission. And undoubtedly, the intestine and microbes within the intestine play an important role in that function. They can trigger nerves insofar as I mean, one nerve is obviously the vagus nerve, that meandering nerve that links the brain with all internal organs in the body, really all primary internal organs in the body. Um, I mean, we've shown that if the vagus nerve is cut, that certain microbes cannot communicate with the brain. So, and there's emerging evidence, for instance, that in diseases like Parkinson's disease, that route of communication might be very important in terms of the pathophysiology or the abnormality that underlies a disease like Parkinson's disease. I mean, we know in Parkinson's that dopamine cells in the brain die. Why they die, of course, is a more complex issue, and many people believe that in fact they die because of a chemical that's produced in the gut called alpha synuclein, and that it tracks up the vagus nerve and actually gets into the brain and kills the dopamine neurons within the brain. Well, the intestine has the second brain, or is surrounded by the second brain, which is the enteric nervous system. That plays a key role in regulating gut activity in terms of regulating motility and so forth, and undoubtedly is involved in signaling pathways to the brain. Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's one that we've been looking at recently in relation to stress. And undoubtedly, in stress related disorders, we find that bacteriophage, which are the viruses within the intestine, that the composition of bacteriophage within the intestine alters in stress related conditions. So I think our knowledge of how viruses influence brain function is way behind our knowledge base in relation to bacteria. But I think it is likely that when we talk about the microbiota influencing the brain, that we're not just talking about bacteria, that viruses and fungi and other microorganisms do play a role as well. It just so happens, well, I suppose that bacteria are number one, more abundant in terms of volume. I mean, at the end of the day, the human adult has about a kilo and a half of bacteria in the intestine, which is the same weight as the human brain. So, in bulk terms, bacteria are undoubtedly the dominant species within the intestine. But that is not to say that other microorganisms within the intestine, such as viruses, don't play a very important role, because they probably do. There are a number of routes of communication through which the brain can communicate with the gut, the vagus nerve being one of them, which is a bidirectional route of communication. Of course, the core stress axis, if we're stressed, cortisol levels rise, and undoubtedly cortisol influences the gut, as does adrenaline and other stress related hormones. So in we know that when people are suffering from anxiety, for instance, that you get changes in stress related hormones. And of course, GI symptoms are very common. Gastrointestinal symptoms are very common. We've all experienced butterflies in the stomach or whatever. Um, of course, they are far more intensified if people have disorders like panic disorder. So, undoubtedly, the transmission of signal from brain to gut is very important, particularly in psychiatric disorders like anxiety disorders and depression. I think it's definitely true to say that there are filtering mechanisms in the brain. We don't want to be bombarded with signals all the time, and to be consciously aware of those. So yes, there is no doubt about it that unconscious or subconscious signaling to the brain is going on all the time, and enables the brain to monitor activity in all organs throughout the body. Undoubtedly, the brain's capacity to signal to the gut does have implications for gut function. Um, Irritable bowel syndrome is one very good example of that. I mean, many patients who suffer from irritable bowel syndrome will tell you that their symptoms get worse when they're stressed. Now, I'm not saying that stress is the cause of irritable bowel syndrome, but patients with irritable bowel syndrome will undoubtedly say that symptoms get worse when they're stressed. And of course, many patients with inflammatory bowel disorders will also say, if I'm very stressed, my symptoms get worse. And this is undoubtedly due to signaling from brain to gut. And, gut motility can be significantly altered as a result, as a response to stress. When you look at the epidemiology of gut dysfunction in psychiatric disorders, up to a third of patients with psychiatric illness will report gut problems. I mean, for example, depression, the most common of all psychiatric disorders, prevalence at least of 5%, if not higher. A significant number of patients with depression, if you ask them, have they seen changes in their intestinal activity while they've been depressed, they will report that they definitely have. It is particularly common in elderly people. Elderly people who become depressed, very often their initial symptom is one of constipation. Their diagnosis may be one of depression, and treating the depression will usually alleviate the constipation. But a very significant percentage of people with mental health issues, not just depression, do have intestinal problems during their illness. Almost definitely it is. I mean, we've looked at patients who are attending my clinic at Cork University Hospital, and we've profiled the microbiota in those patients. And overall, those patients show a decreased diversity of microbes. Now, the implications of that one can theorize or whatever, but definitely in depression, and that there have been multiple replications globally of that finding on both sides of the Atlantic. It's now accepted that patients with major depressive illness do have a decreased microbial diversity, which probably has the knock-on effect of altering bowel activity. Well, we certainly we know from preclinical studies that if you stress animals, the microbiota invariably changes. Stressed animals, they within a relatively short period of time show decreased diversity within the gut microbiota. Now, that I suppose one could attribute to alteration, let's say, in diet, because diet is an important factor in maintaining the architecture of the gut microbiota. But I think it certainly is beyond that. Now, it is worth pointing out that, we've known for 30 years that people in the Mediterranean region who are on a Mediterranean diet have less depression than people who are on a Northern European diet. That's well established. So there are clearly components of diet that have a very positive mental health benefit. And it is increasingly clear that people in Northern Europe who are on a Mediterranean diet have less depression than other people in Northern Europe who are on a more traditional Northern European diet. So I think stress unquestionably has a direct impact on the gut microbiota. But of course, stress can also alter diet, and diet in turn can directly impact the gut microbiota architecture.